the day an empire handed its finances to foreigners. Born in 1299 as a small principality in Anatolia, the Ottoman state expanded across 3 continents over 6 centuries. It reached the gates of Vienna, turned the Mediterranean into something close to an inland sea, and governed vast territories stretching from the Red Sea to the Black Sea, from North Africa to the Balkans. In the 16th century, under Suleiman the Magnificent, it was one of the most powerful, wealthiest, and best organized states in the world. But by the 19th century, that same empire faced a very different reality, dependent on European banks, unable to fully control even a significant portion of its own tax revenue. The story of this transformation begins in the mid-19th century, during a period when the empire was trying to reassert its strength. In 1853, the Ottoman state entered the Crimean War against Russia. This time it wasn't alone. It was allied with 2 major European powers, Britain and France. Stopping Russian expansion in the Black Sea and the Balkans was a shared interest for the Ottomans and their Western allies alike. But war, as in every era of history, brought an enormous financial burden. The army needed feeding, equipping, and its front lines needed constant support. And the government of Sultan Abdülmecid lacked the resources to sustain a war of this scale through traditional tax revenue alone. In 1854, the Ottoman state took out its first official foreign loan from European markets, a first in its history. At the time, this decision seemed entirely reasonable, financing a shared war using the same financial tools as its allies. The first bond, issued on the London market, was in itself a small step, but it marked the beginning of a process that would shape the following 3 decades. Even after the Crimean War ended, the habit of borrowing continued. Under Sultan Abdülmecid, and later his brother Abdulaziz, the empire used European loans both to modernize its army and to fund the grand construction projects that came to define the era. The rise of Dolmabahce Palace was just one of the most visible symbols of this period. Railways were planned, new administrative structures were established, and the army was being equipped to European standards. The logic behind this spending was understandable. The Ottomans wanted to reach the same contemporary standards as a rapidly industrializing Europe. The problem was that revenue could never keep pace with this rate of spending. An economy still largely based on agriculture simply couldn't generate income at the same speed as European states undergoing industrial revolution. This wasn't unique to the Ottomans. In the 19th century, many states, Egypt, Greece, even several Latin American republics, fell into a similar spiral while trying to compete with an industrializing Europe. The drive to modernize grew far faster than the real economic capacity to finance it. By 1875, the picture was clear. Ottoman foreign debt had exceeded 200 million gold lira, an astronomical figure compared to the state budget of the time. The treasury could no longer even make regular interest payments on this debt. That year, the government was forced to issue a formal notice to European creditors. Payments were being suspended. Known in history as the default of 1875, this decision was a major shock not just for the Ottomans, but for the international bond markets of the era. Ottoman bonds became nearly worthless on the London and Paris exchanges, and thousands of small investors lost the bulk of their savings. Meanwhile, the empire was also experiencing major political turmoil at home. In 1876, 2 sultans were deposed in quick succession, first Abdulaziz, then the short-reigned Murad V. Following this period of uncertainty, Abdülhamid II ascended the throne, and after a brief constitutional experiment, adopted an increasingly centralized style of governance. The new sultan was simultaneously working to consolidate his authority at home while inheriting this massive debt problem from abroad. European creditors, French, British, German, Austrian, and Italian banks, along with individual bondholders, began pressuring the Ottoman government through their own governments. Diplomatic correspondence, financial delegations, Years of negotiation followed, and eventually, in 1881, a resolution was reached, the Decree of Muharrem. Under this agreement, the Ottoman state transferred the collection of certain reliable revenue streams, including the salt, tobacco, silk, and stamp taxes, directly to a new institution made up of creditor representatives, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This model wasn't entirely without precedent in the international financial relations of the era. Similar arrangements had been applied in Egypt around the same years, and Greece had set up a comparable system for its own debts. But the Ottoman case stood out for the sheer scale of territory it covered and the detailed organization of its administrative structure. The Public Debt Administration eventually grew so large that, by some estimates, its staff outnumbered that of the empire's own finance ministry. Thousands of officials collected these revenues across the empire, from Anatolia to the Balkans, from Syria to Iraq. The institution had its own auditing mechanisms, its own reporting systems, even its own trained personnel. The consequences of this were multifaceted. On one hand, the system provided a degree of financial stability. Regular payments allowed the Ottomans to regain access to credit in international markets, which postponed the empire's full financial collapse for a time. Some historians emphasize that this system was in fact one of the factors that kept the Ottoman state financially afloat into the 20th century. On the other hand, the arrangement raised deep questions about sovereignty. The fact that an unelected, foreign body controlled the collection of a significant share of tax revenue became a frequent subject of debate among the era's intellectuals and reformist movements. Many figures within the Young Ottomans, and later the Young Turk movement, viewed this as a threat to the empire's independence, a debate that became one of the undercurrents feeding the nationalist and constitutionalist movements that grew in the following decades. The Public Debt Administration continued to operate for nearly 40 years from its founding, through to the First World War, and even beyond the empire's own collapse. When the Ottomans entered the war in 1914, the institution was still active. Though its operations were disrupted amid the chaos of war, it wasn't fully dissolved until the early years of the Republic. After the founding of the Republic of Turkey, part of this debt was assumed by the new state and paid off gradually over a process stretching from the 1920s into the 1950s, a testament to just how long a shadow this story cast. Today, historians generally place this period in a broader context. The Ottomans were not alone in the 19th century. Egypt fell into a similar debt spiral that eventually paved the way toward British control. Greece, shortly after gaining independence, faced a comparable external oversight mechanism. China, by the end of the 19th century, was likewise forced to hand over control of its customs revenue to foreign powers. The common pattern was this: states trying to keep pace with the industrial age tended to spend faster than their real economic capacity could support. And as that gap widened, dependence on foreign debt grew along with it, bringing political and economic constraints in its wake. The Ottoman experience with the Public Debt Administration stands in history as a striking example of just how fragile even a 6th-century-old empire spanning 3 continents could become once it lost control of its own finances. The breadth of its territory, the size of its army, or its past military and cultural power guaranteed nothing about its economic independence in the present. The Ottomans, once Europe's greatest fear in the 16th century, found themselves by the 19th century handing over the work of their own tax collectors to a foreign institution. And perhaps this story reveals something true not just about one empire, but about many states throughout history. A nation's strength isn't measured only by the territory it holds or the victories of its past. It's also measured by how independently it can make its own economic decisions in the present.